In 2024, a sealed attic inside Graceland was opened for the first time in nearly 5 decades. What workers found inside was not just old furniture or forgotten clothing. There were sealed boxes, personal letters, and something that raised immediate questions about the final years of Elvis Presley's life. Some of what was discovered has never been discussed publicly, and the person connected to what was found. That part of the story is what nobody expected. Every year, roughly 500,000 people visit Graceland. They walk through the front door of that white-columned mansion on Elvis Presley Boulevard in Memphis, Tennessee, and they step into a place that feels frozen in time. The shag carpet, the mirrored ceilings, the jungle room with its indoor waterfall, the trophy building filled with gold records and jeweled jumpsuits. Visitors move through room after room, absorbing the carefully preserved world of a man who changed music forever. But for 48 years, there was one part of Graceland that nobody saw. Not tourists, not journalists, not the documentary filmmakers who had made careers out of exploring every corner of Elvis Presley's life. Not even most of the staff who worked at the estate for decades, who knew every hallway and every carefully maintained detail of the mansion's public presentation. The attic stayed closed. Always. What makes that fact remarkable is not simply that it was closed. What makes it remarkable is the nature of the closure itself. There was no official explanation, no sign on the door, no entry in the estate's public documentation explaining why this particular space was inaccessible. Staff members who worked at Graceland during the 1980s and 1990s described something they found difficult to articulate precisely, an understanding shared among everyone who worked there, that the attic was not a topic for discussion, not because anyone had explicitly forbidden it, but because the unspoken weight around the subject made the question feel, somehow, inappropriate to ask. One long-time Graceland employee described it carefully. There were things at Graceland that everybody knew not to push on. The attic was one of them. A decision had been made a long time ago by people who had the authority to make it, and the rest of the world had quietly agreed to respect that decision without being asked to. That kind of collective, unspoken respect does not happen by accident. In the years immediately following Elvis Presley's death on August 16, 1977, Graceland was not a tourist attraction. It was a home in mourning. His father, Vernon Presley, continued to live there. His daughter, Lisa Marie, was 9 years old when she lost her father and grew up in the shadow of a grief that the entire world seemed to share, but that only she and her family truly carried. The decision to open Graceland to the public came in 1982. Certain spaces were prepared for visitors. Others were not. The attic fell firmly into the second category and stayed there, through decades of renovation, through multiple rounds of new management, through the estate's transformation into a major global tourism enterprise. Then something changed. In January 2023, Lisa Marie Presley died at the age of 54 following a cardiac arrest. Her death was sudden and deeply mourned. It left the Graceland estate to her daughter, Riley Keough, Elvis Presley's granddaughter, a woman in her early 30s who had built her own career as an actress, and who suddenly found herself responsible for one of the most valuable and most complex entertainment estates in the world. It was Riley who made the decision to open the attic. Those familiar with the process describe it as something Riley approached with unusual seriousness, not as an administrative task, not as a business decision driven by commercial opportunity, but as something more personal, the act of a young woman trying to understand fully and honestly who her family actually was, beyond the mythology, beyond the icon, beyond the version of the story she had grown up being told. The opening itself was quiet. No camera crew, no announcement. A small team gathered at Graceland and climbed to the attic with documentation and preservation equipment. The air inside was still, dusty, the particular quality of air that has not been disturbed for a very long time. They opened the first box. What was inside stopped the room, not because it was explosive or immediately sensational, but because of what it quietly, unmistakably represented. A story that had been waiting, sealed and patient, for nearly 5 decades. The contents were not memorabilia. not stage props or promotional photographs or the commercial overflow of a famous career. What filled those boxes was personal. Deeply, uncomfortably personal. There were handwritten letters, not typed correspondence managed by assistants, but the kind of writing that happens when something inside a person needs to come out and the only available container is paper. The dates on those letters clustered around a specific period. The mid-1970s. The final years of Elvis's life. The years that biographers have consistently identified as the most turbulent and least understood chapter of his entire story. Some letters were addressed to specific people. Some were addressed to no one. More like private thoughts given the shape of letters, written because the act of writing them was what mattered. The handwriting varied. Some were clearly Elvis's own, confirmed by comparison with authenticated samples. Others were written in different hands. Hands that required careful research to connect to names and faces. Alongside the letters were journals. Not Elvis's own, that distinction matters, but belonging to people who had lived and worked inside Graceland during its most intense years. Members of the inner circle whose names appear in biographies as background figures, but who had never been examined closely. These journals describe daily life inside Graceland with a level of specificity and intimacy that no published account had ever approached. Not the reconstructed intimacy of memoirs written years after the fact, but the raw, immediate intimacy of people writing about what they saw and heard on specific days, in specific rooms, without the organizing framework of retrospect. They described Elvis in ways that were recognizable. The generosity, the humor, the particular quality of presence that everyone who met him seemed to feel, but also in ways that complicated the accepted portrait significantly. A man more aware of his own situation than the mythology typically allows. More conflicted, more privately articulate about the forces shaping his life than the public record had ever suggested. There were also photographs that had never been published. Not professional promotional images, personal photographs. Candid, unguarded, Elvis in recognizable rooms, but in contexts that have never appeared in any published material, with people whose presence in those spaces has never been publicly documented. One face appeared with a frequency and an intimacy that caught the archival team's attention early. A person present across multiple images spanning several years of Elvis's final decade. Present not in the way that peripheral acquaintances appear in the background of famous lives, but with the relaxed, unconscious comfort of someone completely trusted by the person holding the camera. Nobody on the team recognized this person immediately. That fact alone transformed the attic opening from a significant archival discovery into something considerably larger. Because it meant that the story everyone thought they knew had a gap in it. A significant human gap, shaped exactly like the person in those photographs. The archival team did not arrive at this individual's identity quickly. Photographs were cross-referenced. Handwriting was analyzed. Names mentioned in journal entries were traced through available records. What emerged gradually, and then with increasing clarity, was a portrait. This individual was not a musician, not a member of the Memphis Mafia, the famous group of friends and associates whose collective story has been told across dozens of accounts. Not a romantic partner in any conventional sense. Someone who had come into Elvis's world through an unexpected connection in the early 1970s, from a background entirely removed from the entertainment industry. That distance from the machinery of fame was precisely what had made the relationship possible. Elvis Presley lived inside a bubble of extraordinary density. Every person around him connected to the music, the management, the business, the performance. Genuine privacy was almost structurally impossible inside that bubble. Almost. This individual represented a rare breach, a connection to a world outside the machinery. A relationship built not on professional proximity or fan devotion or the complicated dependencies that characterized so many of Elvis's closest relationships, but on something quieter and more reciprocal. Genuine friendship, the kind that does not require anything from the other person except their presence and their honesty. The letters exchanged between them evolved significantly over the years. The early correspondence, dated to the early 1970s, is relatively light. Two people finding their way toward each other, establishing trust, learning the language of a friendship both of them understood was unusual and worth protecting. The later letters are different. As the 1970s progressed and Elvis's health declined and the pressures around him intensified, the correspondence deepened. The letters became longer, more candid, more willing to engage with things that Elvis was apparently unable to say in the spaces where he spent most of his time, surrounded by people whose livelihoods and identities were bound up in his continued performance of a particular version of himself. In the letters to this individual, that performance stopped. What appears on those pages is a man speaking without the filter that fame requires, speaking about what he loved and what he had lost and what he was afraid of, speaking about his music with an honesty about its current state that he could not voice to anyone else, speaking about his body with a clarity suggesting he understood, at some level, exactly what was happening to it, and speaking repeatedly, persistently, about his legacy. He was worried about how he would be remembered, not in the way famous people typically worry about legacy. His concern was more specific, more rooted in a concrete understanding of the forces that were, in his lifetime, already shaping the story being told about him. He was aware, clearly painfully aware, that his narrative was being constructed around him by people whose interests did not always align with his own. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, had exercised control over Elvis's career so total and so long-standing that it had become difficult to see where professional management ended and something more troubling began. The business decisions made in Elvis's name, the refusal of international tours, the relentless scheduling of Las Vegas residencies, the film contracts that wasted his talent, were decisions that Elvis had largely been unable to reverse despite his clear dissatisfaction with them. The letters make that knowledge explicit in ways no previous account had fully captured. He was not the passive figure that standard biography tends to present. He was someone who saw the situation clearly, who pushed against it in the ways available to him, and who carried the frustration of those limitations with a self-awareness that makes reading those letters, decades later, genuinely difficult. One entry in a journal kept by a member of Elvis's inner circle describes a specific evening in the final 2 years of his life. Elvis and this trusted individual sitting together on the back porch of Graceland after dinner, talking for several hours while the rest of the household gave them space. The journal writer does not record what was said, but the observation that follows is striking in its simplicity. He seemed like himself tonight, not the performance, himself. That distinction sits at the heart of everything the attic materials are revealing. The version of Elvis that the world consumed and the person who existed beneath it were not always the same thing. And the individual who had the most consistent access to the real, unperformed self is someone the world is now meeting for the first time. There is a moment in one of the later letters, written in 1976, less than a year before Elvis's death, that those who have read it describe as the most striking piece of writing in the entire collection. Elvis is reflecting on what he wants people to understand about him. Not the music, though the music matters enormously. The man. He writes that he is tired of being a story that other people tell, that he has spent his whole life being translated, his words, his choices, his feelings rendered into versions that serve purposes other than the truth. He writes that what he wants, more than almost anything else he can name, is for someone to one day tell the real story, not the myth, the man. He does not know, writing those words in 1976, that the real story will spend the next 48 years in a sealed attic. But he writes as though he trusts that the person reading his letter will make sure it survives long enough to matter. That trust was honored. Now the question of what happens next belongs to one person. Riley Keough, 23 years old when her grandmother's estate passed to her mother, 33 when it passed her, did not choose this weight. She was born into it, and she has approached it with a seriousness that has surprised people who expected the transition to be primarily administrative. She engaged directly with the archival materials. She asked questions that went beyond commercial and legal dimensions into historical and human ones. She wanted to understand not just what the Elvis Presley estate owned and controlled, but what it actually represented. What the truth of her great-grandfather's life actually was, beneath the layers of mythology and management and 50 years of carefully curated public presentation. Those familiar with her approach describe someone thinking not in the short-term cycles of entertainment news, but in the longer arc of historical legacy. Someone asking not what will generate the most attention when released, but what will still feel right in 20 years. What will serve the true understanding of her great-grandfather's life in ways the existing narrative has failed to do. The decisions are not simple. Some of the people who appear in the attic materials are still living. Their connection to Elvis has never been part of the public record. The question of whether and how to bring that connection into the open carries real consequences for real people. The commercial machinery of the Elvis Presley estate, annual revenues consistently in the tens of millions, depends at least in part on the stability of the existing narrative. Introducing elements that complicate or contradict aspects of the story that commercial infrastructure has been built upon carries genuine risk. Riley Keough has refused to let that perspective be the only one in the room. She has been consulting with historians, with archivists, with people whose expertise is the careful and responsible handling of significant historical materials. She has been reading the letters herself, looking at the photographs, sitting with the journals written by people who knew Elvis in the spaces the public never saw, trying to know him, not the king of rock and roll, the man who wrote those letters in a handwriting that grew less steady as the years went on, who worried about his legacy with an honesty that the official story never captured, who trusted a small number of people with the truth of his inner life, and hoped that truth would survive long enough to matter. There's something profound about a great-granddaughter sitting with the private thoughts of a man she never met, reading his words across a distance of nearly 50 years, trying to understand the gap between the person he was and the story the world was told about him. The timeline for what comes next has not been publicly announced. The form it will take, documentary, published collection, exhibition, is still being determined. The people involved are not rushing. They understand that what they are handling deserves the time it takes to do it right. But the attic has been opened. The materials have been read. The identity of the person at the center of the story has been established. The truth that Elvis Presley spent his final years trying to preserve has survived exactly as he intended it to. 48 years of patience. 48 years of sealed boxes and unspoken rules and a quiet, collective decision to protect something until the world was ready. That wait, it finally seems, is over. Elvis Presley once wrote that he was tired of being a story that other people tell, that he wanted someone to tell the real one. The myth has had 50 years. The man has been waiting in a sealed attic, honest and preserved and exactly as he always wanted to be, for his turn. That turn is coming. And when it arrives, when the letters are published and the photographs are seen, and the full story of those final years is finally told with the completeness it deserves, the world will not just learn something new about Elvis Presley. It will meet him for the very first time. If this story has stayed with you, if the idea of a truth preserved across 50 years, waiting for the right moment and the right person to release it, has moved you, then there are more stories like this one waiting to be told. Subscribe now, so the next one finds you the moment it goes live. The attic has been opened, but the story of what comes out of it is still unfolding. And the next chapter is the one that changes everything.